Okay, so welcome everybody to another one of our lectures in the course on inequality and poverty in Latin America. Today, we're incredibly fortunate to have Professor Orazio Attanasio, who's a Kauf's professor of economics at Yale University and the co-chair of the LASIR project, the project on which many of the presentations have been based on. And so we'll hear from one of the founders of this project what the ideas that gave rise to the initiative were, and also what is expected in terms of outcomes. And Professor Attanasio holds a number of very distinguished positions. He's a fellow, associate fellow of research associate, I think, is NBR, and many other distinguished uh, organizations associated with development economics and fiscal studies. And today he's going to talk about inequality of opportunity and the life cycle of inequality, which is a theme within the LASIR project, not just on the paper of which Professor Attanasio is a co-author, he's also going to cover other papers that were included in the project. So, Professor Attanasio, the floor is yours. If you would like to share a little bit about your trajectory, as I mentioned earlier, you are welcome to spend as much time as you want on this.
All right. Thank you very much, Nora, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be part of this. Let me just start. Nora asked me to say a few words how I got to do what I do. And I know that you're students and you might want to hear how people get to do certain things. I won't go into the details because that would be too boring. But the more general advice that I'd like to give students, including my students, your priority should be in doing something that you find interesting. And once you do that, once you have the courage even to bet on your interests, then things become much easier and much more rewarding. Obviously there are failures, and one tries to learn from failures as well as successes. But I got here because I look at problems and I think, okay, this looks an interesting thing to study, and then I go and try to understand what's happening in the world about that. And economic models can be useful to do that. But that's enough of the general thing, I think. So let's go into the details. I will share my screen. I prepare a few slides on this topic. So the topic of today's lecture is about the inequality opportunities in Latin America. Let me see if I can manage to do this. Okay. So let me start saying a few things about this LASIR initiative. LASIR stands for Latin America and the Caribbean's Inequality Review. So as you probably already know, Latin America is one of the most unequal regions in the world. And so a few years ago, a group of researchers, including myself, decided to start a research initiative to study inequalities in Latin America. And that's what LASIR is. So we formed an interdisciplinary panel of about 15 researchers from different disciplines. I'm afraid that there is a majority of economists, but we had sociologists, epidemiologists, a variety of political scientists, a variety of disciplines. So we start discussing inequalities in Latin America. And here the plural is important because one of the things that we realized earlier on that Latin America, as other regions in the world, is not only unequal in income or in wealth. Inequality is pervasive in many, many dimensions. We find, as we'll see, inequality in education, inequality in health, inequality in different forms of well-being. So we start discussing these inequalities, and we decided to organize rather than divide this project around five themes. And we the panel commissioned a number of papers on each of these themes. Let me go briefly through these five themes. The first one was we want to establish the facts. Everybody says, oh, in Latin America, it's very unequal. But then we want to lay the ground here and say, okay, inequalities are relevant in many dimensions. How serious are in each of these ones? The other thing, yes, Latin America is a very unequal region, but different countries have different experiences of inequality. Some countries are very unequal, others are much less so. And even today, later on, I'll show you some of this evidence. And then we can talk about in the first theme is the establishing the facts is about recent trends in inequality. Inequality at some point seems to have been declining, although not everybody agrees on that. In more recent years, it seems to be coming back up. So that was the first themes, and we have a theme, and we have a number of papers that we commissioned on this. Oh, one thing that I should mention, actually, just to do a little bit of publicity to this initiative. There were a total of, I believe, 29 papers in the five themes. These papers have been submitted to a journal, Oxford Economic Papers, and they will come out on March 3rd. There will be a link with open access to everybody to read all 29 papers or a subset of them if you cannot bear them all. So keep watching this space because in a week or so, these papers will be all available on Oxford Economic Papers in the journal. So the second theme, which is the one I will be focusing on today, is about the life cycle of inequalities. And so we will be talking about the fact that inequality starts very early on and then proceeds and amplifies and evolves over individuals' lives. The third theme is about the drivers of inequalities. And there we talk about what happens in the labor market and in the commodities markets. The labor markets are important because it's where people earn a living and are characterized by all sorts of inequalities. Some are generated early in life, as we'll say later on today. Some are driven by different markets imperfections and the like. Including imperfections in commodity markets. In many commodity markets in Latin America, there is a considerable amount of market power. And this presence of monopolies creates inequalities and creates additional profits that are typically enjoyed by only a subset of the population. The fourth theme of the study was and this is a theme on which Nora has been playing a major role with her research and the direct contributions to last year, is about the redistributive role of the state. And the governments raise taxes, but as Nora has said many times, taxes are only one aspect of the whole story. How governments spend their money is incredibly important. And government expenditure includes transfers, but also includes a number of public services that are provided, like education and the like. And the whole pension systems and health systems are very, very important to determine in the end to what extent the state attenuates, or in some cases accentuates the level of inequality that happens in the market. And indeed, Nora's work has shown that there is a lot of diversity in Latin America on the role that the state plays in determining inequality. And some of this can be very, very subtle. An important contribution to the whole research that I don't have the time or expertise for that matter to discuss today is the role of informality. Informality is a huge deal in Latin America. There are lots of large chunks of societies that go through informal labor market. If you go to a country like Bolivia or Ecuador, it's over 50%. It's more like close to 70% of individuals that work informally. And some of the panel members think that the government can play, the state can play a somewhat perverse role by creating incentives to informality through the tax and benefit system. So all this is very complex, and there are in the review there are some a number of papers that look at these issues. And the fifth theme is the political economy of inequality. So how does inequality survive for so many centuries, if you wish? How is it driven by historical accidents, by colonial inheritance and the like? And also how inequality manifests inequality in political voice. Do all citizens in Latin America have the same voice? And the answer is probably no, and more so than in other countries. So that's just to give you a taste of what the review is coming to be. These are the theme. In each of these themes, there are a number of papers that have been written, and they'll be out in a few days. I didn't say, feel free to interrupt me with questions. Nora is gonna, or Ludovico are gonna read them in the chat box, and I'll be happy to stop and answer any questions that may arise. So the life cycle of inequalities. So today I will talk about the second theme of the review. And start by saying inequality starts very early in the life cycle. And by very early, I mean by age 3. You can already observe an amazing amount of inequality. A paper that I don't have the graph in my presentations, but a paper that I advise you to read, and I found shocking when I read it maybe 15 years ago, is a paper by Norbert Schady and Christine Paxson, in which they looked at data from Ecuador. And their sample was a sample of children aged 6 months, and then they were followed for a number of years. And already at 6 months, and they were all relatively poor people. We're talking about the bottom 50% of the population. But even in that group, by age 3, there were some considerable differences in cognitive development. And then by age 6 months, and then they start increasing. When we arrive at age 6, which is the age at which children start school, there is within that population a considerable difference between the bottom 20% and the top 20%. A difference of, the statistical term is the 0.8 standard deviation of development, which, if you want to translate in terms of age, is 1.5 or 2 years of delay. So you take, say, 6 years old from the top 20%, and compare it to a 6 years old from the bottom 20%, the poorer kid has a developmental age of a 4-year-old rather than a 6-year-old. And so imagine what happens if you put in a classroom these two kids. The one that is more developed already because of where the families they come from, will have already an advantage. And the poor kid, the kid from the poor families, they will be already delayed, and these delays will start accumulating. And so what determines these delays? Definitely families, family structures, social norms, and something that I worked a lot on during the last 15 years or so is parenting practices. There is evidence, not only from Latin America, but from other countries as well, that what parents do in the first 2 years of life is very important for individual behavior, for individual development. But also, there is evidence that poor parents tend to not stimulate their children as much as families from richer backgrounds. And they don't, that's not just the lack of resources. It might be related to the lack of resources, because if you're stressing out and worrying about finding enough money to arrive to the end of the month, you might have less energy, less bandwidth to talk to your children and stimulate them and engage them. Or it might be simply the fact that you don't think that those things are particularly important. So there is some evidence that that's the case, and the result is that the poor children end up developing at a much slower pace. And then once you do that, once you go through that, these inequalities are mediated and accentuated by education systems, because typically poor children have access to worse education, and then these initial disadvantages get amplified by that. And then you go to college, if you do, and the sort of people that have access to tertiary education is different, and even the quality of tertiary education you have access to is different. So we'll be focusing on this aspect, and we call it inequality of opportunities. Why inequality of opportunities? Why is it so important? If you read the literature on inequality and the ethics of inequality, there's been lots of discussions on the difference between what is called the inequality of outcomes, i.e., some people are richer than others, and then inequality of opportunities. So some people do not have the opportunity to achieve certain goals or certain outcomes in their life. And inequality of outcomes probably is driven both by factors that individuals can control, how hard you work, how hard you study, and factors that the individuals don't control. And the general perceptions in societies around the world is that, the inequality of opportunities is determined completely by factors beyond individual control. And the general perception is that inequality of opportunities seems unfair. It might be okay if you're richer than the next guy, if you work much harder, you deserve it. But it seems unfair if that is just determined by where you're born, by the luck of being born in a wealthy family rather than in a poor family. And therefore, it seems that policy interventions are more justified and more desirable in the case of inequality of opportunities. So what opportunities are we talking about? Opportunities is a difficult thing to define, and the studying the equality of opportunities can be very complex, and these issues can be seen from different angles. But it is important. Inequality of opportunities is also strictly linked to social mobility. That's what I meant when I said a minute ago, is that what you achieve in life might be determined by what to an extent, but where you're born, and that denotes a lack of social mobility. And so in the last year, we commissioned papers that look at these different aspects. We looked at social mobility, looked at the early years. We looked at the role of families. We look at the inequality in race and ethnicity, which is one specific aspect of inequality of opportunities. Actually, and then spatial inequality. So let me go through the different chapters that in turn, and I will say a few things about them and try to draw some of the connections among them. But again, if you're interested in any of these things, in a few days, you'll be able to go and read the thing. The first paper contains also methodological innovations. Was written by Paolo Brunori, Chico Ferreira, and Guido Neidhofer. It's Inequality of Opportunity, Intergenerational Persistence in Latin America. And this is an excellent paper which provides both a lot of new evidence and a methodological contribution. In this sense, the paper distinguishes between social mobility in a specific outcome, say income, education, and inequality of opportunities is defined as the predictive power of a set of circumstances. So where you're born, what's your parents' education, what's your gender, what is your ethnicity, what role any of these circumstances play in predicting your income or your education. And the paper distinguishes between ex ante and ex post inequality of opportunity. So the ex ante concept is the expected value of a given outcome, say income, for a given type, say the children of well-educated parents. The entire so is the mean of this distribution. So you have a population, and this population is made by different types, say male or females, or black and whites, or well-educated family, less educated families. So these are the types, and these types predict a mean. But the mean is not the only relevant thing. You might want to look at the entire distribution, and that's what they call the exposed distribution of that outcome. You're not just interested in the mean income for a given type, but also how the distribution of income of different types, the entire distribution differ. So the methodological innovation introduced in the paper is very interesting. By the way, maybe I should. Um, it's better to close that little window. Um, and one interesting thing is that the approach proposed lets the data speak about what is the best definition of circumstances with respect to a given outcome variable. So they don't say, okay, we need to look at education or we need to look at gender, but they let the data be informative about what are the relevant partitions that one should define. Um, and and one thing that comes out is that these partitions vary greatly in different countries in the region. And so the paper also provides sharply valued decompositions on the basis of the partitions that are determined as important. The results are the basic results agree with the existing literature. The Latin American and Caribbean region has a very low intergenerational mobility, mainly in education, by international standards. Although some recent trends have shown some improvements. Number two is that there is a lot of heterogeneity across countries. And number three is that in any case, inequality of opportunity in the region is very high. So I won't spend much time on the tables, but I will leave, I understand that this lecture is going to be put on YouTube, but I will leave these slides so make them available. And so this gives you for each of these countries how the ex ante value decomposition, sharply value decomposition, how much is determined by gender, by birthplace, by ethnicity, father's education, mother's education, and parental education. And you can see that the education stuff is by far in many countries very, very important. Birthplace is all, locality is also important, but it varies from town to town, from country to country. Look at Argentina is 35%. In Ecuador is only 2%. So there is a lot of variation in how these factors determine inequality. And this is the exposed, which looks at the entire distribution. And again, there is a lot of heterogeneity. Again, birthplace and father's educations in many countries tends to be very important. And then they look at the inherited share of the education. They look at the relative Gini, ex ante and exposed. So let me not spend too much time on this, but I don't know whether you've been familiar with the Ginis, but these are very high level. So Gini, look at Guatemala, 0.6 is a very, very high. So the second paper, I collaborated to the writing of these papers with Florencia Lopez-Bo, Diana Perez Lopez, and Sarah Reynolds, and we look at different countries. As I said, the main motivation was the early impressive evidence from Peru, presented by Chris Paxson and Norbert Shady. My intuitions and my interpretation of the evidence, much of it is driven by parenting practices and other environmental factors that affect child development in very early years. And the paper emphasizes a lot the longitudinal aspects of the evidence, because can be very informative about the dynamics of inequality over the life cycle. The paper analyzes countries for which we have some data, Unfortunately, and that's something that I'll come back to, there is not much data set that are comparable across countries and that are longitudinal. So these are 5 countries, and we have to stretch this. For instance, we only can look at some aspects in Mexico simply because we don't have data. But so the 5 countries are Chile, Colombia, Peru, Uruguay, and Mexico. We look at the different dimensions of inequality. We look at cognition and the social emotional skills. If you, I've been teaching a class on inequality and social mobility in the US. In the old days, the analysis of inequality focused mainly on cognitive inequalities, often education. There are some better educated and worse educated, and the idea is that the better educated had more connections. More recently, economists have been realizing that cognitive ability is only one aspect of the skills that people are endowed with, and then social emotional skills are very, very important in the production process, and therefore in determining people's earnings. Again, we find lots of heterogeneity across countries. We have in our group of countries, we have countries with very high inequality, like Colombia and Peru, in terms of income, and these countries also show high inequality in child development. So there seems to be this parallel between inequality in income or wealth and inequality in child development. The longitudinal analysis we think is more informative than the cross-sectional one. And so these are some um, uh, levels of inequality. This is, we don't do Gini's, so these are the difference between the second, third, and fourth quartile of the relative to the first quartile in terms of cognitive development, which is measured by some vocabulary tests, which are comparable across countries. You can see here we don't have Mexico. Why don't we have Mexico? Because we don't have data on this particular outcome in Mexico. And you can see that Uruguay is much less unequal. There are not huge differences there compared to Chile, and even more in Colombia, and even more in Peru. If you look at the top top quartile in Peru is one standard deviation more than the bottom quartile. So that's a lot of inequality there. In Colombia, we distinguish between urban and rural, and remarkably, the urban one seems slightly more unequal than the rural one. And then we look at social emotional skills, which, oh, sorry, this is pure cognition again. And here we don't have vocabulary. The reason language is a very good predictor of future outcomes. And that's why we were keen. And moreover, these are comparable across countries. We have a general index of cognition that is also available in Mexico. And so here we can compare the 5 countries, but we don't have that for Colombia. So Colombia is missing from this graph. And it's interesting, the Uruguay that looked in terms of vocabulary, which I personally think is more reliable than this particular cognitive outcomes that we have here. It seems very not very unequal in cognition. In this index of cognition seems to be more unequal, and definitely more unequal than Chile, which is the opposite here. And this is the social emotional skills. Now, Uruguay is the most unequal, and the other countries are much more equal. Social emotional skills reflect, how sociable people are, how driven they are, the ability to focus and the like. This is now this is the kind of cross-sectional evidence, and now we look at the social at the longitudinal dimension. So how things evolve with age, and the age here is in months. Unfortunately, we don't. In Uruguay, we observe kids at 6 months, and we follow them until 120 months, which means 5 years. In Chile, we observe them a bit older, not 6 months, and we follow them over time. In Colombia, we follow up to 200 months and so on. So there are differences here on when the data are available. And there are, this is the vocabulary evolution. As before, Uruguay is not very unequal. So this is the bottom and the top quartile that are wealth quartiles that are plotted, and Chile is more unequal, but it goes, if anything, it goes down with age, and they are stable in urban Colombia. They expand in rural Colombia, and they are pretty much parallel in Peru. So one last point on this, I already mentioned it. There is a big lack of good quality measures of child development in the early years. So probably the best measures are available in Chile. There's a very nice survey, which is LP, which is called LP. Even a country like Colombia, which usually Colombia is good for data, in this case, there is no representative sample of child development in the early years, none. The best data is this data set called the ELCA, but the ELCA is representative of the bottom 80% of the population. The rich are just not there. And so we cannot tell you, there's pictures that I had for Colombia. This is the bottom 80%, which is, a big chunk of the population, but the rich are not there. The top 20% are not there. And this is very, very unfortunate. I think in the future, one hopes that better measures are collected and more representative samples are available. So this is an example where the third paper I'm talking about, the family change in Latin America, these are not the authors, Albert Esteve, Andres Casta, and Federica Becca. They are not economists, they are more sociologists, but it shows us this interdisciplinary research can be indeed quite rewarding and productive. So they show trends in family changes and children's status. They look at the women aged 25 to 29 and children aged 7 to 16. And they look at variation in educational attainment. And they show that there are strong correlation. This is not causation, but they're interesting between the type of families that are prevalent and both children's schooling and the female labor force participation. So different forms of partnership formation and parenthood are observed, and these have been changing over time. There is a system of rigid social stratification with limited intergenerational social mobility, as family ethos are very specific to different social classes, and they are shaped by very different income levels and social status. So there are some socially privileged and socially disadvantaged peoples, and these things matter for the type of families that are prevalent. So the expansion of educational attainment in the region has not occurred as in other parts of the world, such as in Europe, but especially Southeast Asia. the region continues to be very much an elitist region in terms of educational attainment. And third, I already mentioned informality, but informality is not only prevalent in labor markets but also in housing, and this type of informality has greatly influenced the household structure and how family formation shapes. So these are fertility rates, and these are different countries in the region. One thing that I found shocking since I started working in Latin America, how quickly fertility has decreased in the region. So this is the number of children per woman. Remember, 2.1 is reproduction. And you can see, if you look at the blue line, which is Brazil, I believe, drops from over 6 to below 2 in 50 years, from 1960 to 2010. That's a very quick drop, much faster than in other regions of the world. The other thing that we see is that there are also a slight decline in the percentage of children that live with both parents. So there is a decline of that. And this is the type of families uh, uh, in the top are single mothers, either in nuclear or non-nuclear families, so living with the mother's parents, for instance, in the case of nuclear. And you can see that they might be higher than in other regions of the world. Colombia is about 20% single mothers, non-nuclear, but they're pretty flat over time. What is increasing is the cohabitating mothers, while the percentage of married mothers is declining over time in all three countries that are evidentiated here. So Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia. And you see, these things matter. It's not to say, people are living as a couple as before, but it's just that now they're not getting married. There is evidence that cohabitating couples are much more likely to break up than married couples. There is evidence from a variety of countries of that. So it does matter whether whether couples are married or not, and we observe this trend, this decline. And then you can see that where children aged 7 to 16 live, and how is that different across different countries. These are in alphabetical order. Argentina is the top. You can see that almost 50% live in married couples. And if you look at both married, nuclear, and non-nuclear, you go to over 60%. If you add the cohabitating, you arrive to almost everybody. So the single mothers are much fewer in Argentina than in other countries. So look at the Dominican Republic. The blue lines are much smaller than the others. So there is a lot of heterogeneity across countries. And this is the children's school attendance. So this is where the children aged they live, how many in each group, and these are how the varied how much they attend school. And you can see that there is a strong correlation between family status and the school attendance. So children that live in married nuclear families and then married non-nuclear families are much more likely to be in school than children in other types of families. And also women labor force participation is also correlated with family status. And those are very strong effects across many countries. Okay, then there was another paper on gender inequality in Latin America and the Caribbean. I I worry about the fact that so let me ask my hosts because obviously I don't have time to go over all this. I've done 27 slides out of 70, and I'm already 50 minutes into the talk. Um,
You,
so
you,
what do you?
you're fine to go another 15 minutes?
But
Yeah,
probably wants to know what to emphasize, right?
yeah,
So you have the gender inequality. You've already discussed early childhood, your paper, right?
yeah.
The family formation and inequality of opportunities.
So let me do gender, and then I'll skip space, and I'll skip ethnicity.
Yeah,
I'll leave the
we had a
slide.
presentation on race.
Okay.
The thing that if you have, I was going to ask you that question. If you have any indication that beyond the characteristics that you showed initially that had to do with the location, parents' education, etc., whether controlling for all the other factors, whether you find an impact of ethnicity. I don't know if anybody did that, but I'm just curious.
And the paper on ethnicity had some of it. And so even after controlling for educations for other stuff, ethnicity does, especially in some countries.
Yeah.
Uh,
Not in these papers. Right? These papers didn't look at, I think the gender team told us that they didn't have the data to do an analysis by ethnicity, so they couldn't.
yeah, yeah, not in these papers, no. Okay, let me spend a few words on the gender stuff. There is a huge number of evidence here on the gender, and they document in this paper. Ines Perniel, Raquel Fernandez, and Sonia Kurtikova document a lot of evidence on different gaps that are present um, in the um, um, in the analysis, and so they look at gender gaps in education and in work. For education, they look at the primary, from pre-primary to tertiary levels, on the quality of education and on attitudes and expectations that people have about education, which is also an under-researched topic, which is very important. And then they look at the gender gaps in participation to work, time spent in work, quality of jobs, remunerations, and gender gaps. And throughout the analysis, they divide Latin America in three groups. So lower middle income, higher middle income, and high income countries. So let's try to go to some of this. So this is preschool attendance among children aged 5. And so the high income are Argentina, Chile, Panama, Uruguay. So that's the average, and that's the OECD average as a comparison. The upper middle income is Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Mexico, and Peru. And the lower middle income is Bolivia, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Paraguay, and I don't know what this is.
Salvador, El
Yeah,
Salvador.
sorry. I should have done that. And then the orange bars are girls, and the blue bars are boys, and that's the percentage that are in preschool at the age 5. And there are not huge differences across genders here, with some exceptions maybe, but there are a lot. big difference across countries. If you compare the high-income countries to lower middle income, look at Guatemala and compare it to Argentina, is 32% compared to 96, 97%. So there are the huge differences, which is probably to be expected, but I wasn't expecting them to be so high. How things change over time, there's been an increasing and again, here you can see women and men, low middle income, high middle income, and high. And so there seems to be some convergence. The difference here in 2000 between the poorest countries and the richest is larger than in more recent years. So there seems to be a general uptrend and a decline in the gaps. This is primary school completion. Again, not huge differences across genders. If anything, say in a country like Brazil, the completion of primary school is higher for girls than for boys, 88 against 82%. But the big difference are between the high and low middle income countries, which have, we are not talking about high school, we are talking about primary school. It's still, if you, a country like Guatemala, girls only 64% complete primary school, boys 72%. And that's how these things have evolved over time. Again, there is some improvement and some closing of the gap between low, middle income and the rest of the countries. This is now we start seeing more action here is secondary school completion. Interestingly, both in high income and upper middle income countries, the figures are better for girls than for boys. To an extent, this is also true in the OECD. But in a country like Argentina, girls is 75% versus 67% for boys. And the same is true in many upper middle income. Things are different, a bit different in lower middle income countries. You don't see this prevalence of girls over boys, with possibly the exception of Nicaragua. And here, the upper trend is maybe slower, and even the closing of the gap is a bit slower. And this is a higher education completion. Now we are much lower numbers here, of course, and now again, high income and upper middle income, there is an advantage for girls or for men, for women rather than men. But we are talking about a much lower level than the average OECD figures. And this is the completion rates, how they have evolved over time. If anything, there is a divergence here in the sense that girls are coming, this is the OECD, and girls are progressing much more, but in Latin America, things are flatter. The evolution is flatter. I think I would rather stop here and maybe take a few questions rather than going at full speed on all the other gaps in this. And then as I said, I'll leave the slides available if anybody wants to look at them.
Excellent, thank you. We do have a question in the Q&A, and I'll read it for you. It's although rural children, Colombia, were represented in the data samples, the remote parts of the Pacific region were excluded. if she remembers correctly. Would you predict or expect similar outcomes for children in those excluded parts of the Pacific region of Colombia?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I can give you what my intuition is because I don't have the data to answer that question. It's true that entire regions are excluded from the available data. My intuition is that, especially in those regions, the level of poverties are such that one would expect even worse delays in child development there than in other regions. And this is very unfortunate for two reasons. The first one is the obvious one. It is a pity that so many children are left without the opportunities of developing their full potential. And that's evident in those regions. The second one is less dramatic, but also important. Is a pity that we do not have the data to even assess how large these gaps are, and I think the better data should be collected in this, so that we have an idea of where. And when I say better data, it's not just running a survey that includes the Pacific, the Choco, and the other regions in Colombia. It's also data that are rich enough, measuring different dimensions of child development, that would allow us to understand better how these different skills evolve. Because you see, if you're running a policy, if you're in government and you're running an intervention in policy, the amount of resources that are available is limited. So you cannot, there are some really cool interventions that they can achieve a lot, but they cost a huge amount of money, and we don't have either the financial or the human resources to deploy such interventions at scale. Then what do you do? I have a limited amount of things that I can do. Would I focus on social emotional skills? Would I focus on cognition at age 3? Because I could achieve those in different ways and with different interventions. And if I have to choose between one intervention and the other, which one would I choose? And until I know, until I have a better understanding of a process of child development, that's a very difficult choice to make. And so the availability of rich data should be very, very important and extremely useful to address those policy issues.
Incidentally, one of our students is asking if you would weigh in on what strategies could be most effective in addressing gaps in cognitive and social-emotional development.
Even the expensive ones, what would be the idea?
So, okay, I will give an answer which is very much biased by my own experience, but we all do, don't we? So I've been working a lot with this lady called Sally Grant McGregor. She's rightly famous because many years ago she developed an intervention in Jamaica, and it's one of the few studies in the world where these kids were. They were 129 children in Kingston, Jamaica, undernourished kids with serious delays in their development. And the intervention was home visits that lasted an hour a week for about 2 years. They started when the kids were about 6 months old, and they continued for 2 years, and then they stopped. And these same children, they've been followed for over 30 years. And what she found, she and her collaborators found, is that after 30 years, the children that had received the intervention were earning more, they were less likely to commit crime, they were leading better lives. And that is an amazing and powerful result. Now, how you deploy such an intervention at scale, that's a big challenge. We've been studying a similar intervention in Colombia. We were only partly successful. We have been studying different modality of delivering rather than doing home visits. So you have a visitor that goes to the home of these children and interacts with the child and the mother an hour a week. That's effective. Alternatively, you can have a number of mothers meet as a group with the person running the program and having group visits rather than home visits. That could be cheaper and potentially even more effective. We had done an experiment of this type in India, and we found that the impact of the home and the group visits were the same, the size of the impact. It was not negligible. In India was 0.3 of a standard deviation. You remember where I told you the gap in Ecuador between the bottom and top 20% was 0.8 of the standard deviation. So that was like filling half that gap. It's not enough, but it's better than nothing. So that's but the big challenge for this thing is how you do this at scale. And it's not just a matter of money. It's not just a matter of resources. I think the big because these are interventions that are trying to change individual behavior. We are not giving these people any money, but we are trying to change their parenting practices. And to achieve that, you have to have buy-in from the communities that receive the intervention. So the community participation and community ownership of this type of programs is key to their success. But this is my intuition. It's not, I wish I had more evidence, hard evidence, to basis these statements on. But that's what I think at the moment.
Thank you.
I don't know if is there anybody else? Otherwise,
Yes, there's another question. It's related to artificial intelligence. Do you see it influencing language and cognitive development? And what do you think the best way to proceed with it is?
A difficult one. I probably the answer is yes, in the sense that it will be important. How, I have no idea. If you ask me, maybe, when I was talking about the scalability, we want to implement these interventions at scale. We have to have lots of visitors. And so, you cannot clone Sally and send her around Latin America all over the places. But so you want to have this intervention delivered by individuals which have a much less formation and abilities and stuff. So maybe the way Sally did it, her curriculum is very structured. So it's a book, and the visitor every week pulls out a leaf from this book, and this leaf say, do this activity, this puzzle, this song, this play. Okay, it's very prescriptive. And the reason she did it this way, I talked to her lots of times about this, is because she says, it's not that I want to be prescriptive, but I want this thing to be delivered by all sorts of people. And some of these ladies are not child development specialists. So I need to hold their hands on doing this and doing the right thing. So maybe one can design some apps, some ChatGPT version of this that can help the visitors. But this is probably going to be the future. But I don't know whether anybody's working on this. But maybe.
Yes, actually, I was going to ask you something in the direction also, because AI may also help people with lower language development do catch up later as well.
Yeah.
As,
Yeah.
as a tool. So I think to look at what the implications are of the new technology on this issue might be quite an interesting subject. Maybe one of your students, a PhD thesis on
Indeed,
that.
indeed, indeed. But the thing is that, it would be nice if you want to do that, then you'll have to try it out. And
Right.
so doing
Yeah.
intervention and train ChatGPT to do something like that.
Or another because now ChatGPT has become like the word in that there's others, Gemini, Claude, and so I'm sure that there may be interest by the AI firms, to sort of fund something
Yeah.
like this.
I think, though, that a tidbit in your data is interesting regarding this discussion because the differences you showed between Chile and Uruguay, where Uruguay doesn't seem to show inequalities in the cognitive side, but does show them in the socio-emotional one, and it
Yeah,
shows the way around.
there's probably driven, probably, you'll have to ask Nora, she knows her Uruguay better than I do. Maybe Uruguayans
I'm
are
going to
not
ask my Uruguayan co-author this afternoon. Uh,
exactly. Ask them about how,
what is the explanation, and I'll let everybody know if there is one. But I
how,
want to ask you something else, which is a little more systemic. When we focus on what happens in early childhood, it's sort of like we're trying to remediate what a system is producing. Right? The fact that you have parents that are poor and with little resources or know-how or patience, etc., to be able to help their children develop into the full potential is a consequence of the fact that they're poor, right? Um,
yeah,
so when we focus on what to do about inequality and poverty, this is a more sort of broader question. How much do we have to think about what I would call more remedial actions that are important versus focusing on leveling the playing field ex ante, so that you don't have so many people that are poor are unable to provide their children with.
yeah, but okay, I can flip that around on you, Nora, because I could say, look, if you do the right sort of interventions on developing children skills, then next generation is going to be much more equal in terms of their cognitive abilities and the like. Now, it's true that there are other sources. So, it could be that it's not just smartness or IQ or social emotional skills. It could be connections that are important, and you might want to work on that as well. But
Has that been shown that do we have long enough studies that show historically how improving? No, we don't. Okay.
well, what we know, the only really long run study in a developing country is the Jamaica study. And there's 129 kids.
Which is small. Yeah, I was going to ask you were they able to have enough power to assess empirically?
Well, the impact is large enough that even that you can see them.
Okay.
It is incredible that And by the way, if you look at the U.S., the only study that I know of that has followed kids for a long time is the Perry Preschool program, which is even smaller. This is the stuff Heckman has been studying for a long time.
Mm.
The PPP sample is 111.
Yeah. So there it's evidence, but very, very small scale and apparently
Yeah,
scalable. Then, a different question has to do with COVID, which we have not really incorporate in a sort of a frontal way in the LASIR project. But in the area of education and development and nutrition, etc., you could have effects that will be lasting. And we probably should say something when we have our
yeah, I know, and I haven't done any work on COVID. It was partly my reaction to I just couldn't bear it, but to work on that. but it is obvious that not only had an impact, but probably this impact was very, very different across social classes because
Right.
you
Yeah,
know,
we have a paper, by the way, with Guido Neidhofer and myself and other authors on the impact of education, prediction of educational achievement with a model. And we show that the decline in secondary completion could be significant and very different across socioeconomic groups. So this may generate a backward, trend unless because the remedial action, even in the U.S., we see it's not happening, right? I mean, now the tests show that there's been an impact that's lingering. So I think it might be important to consider that in sort of the overview about what may happen and the importance of
yeah.
intensifying the remedial actions now, which may delay for some of the children, so that the sort of going back is not so severe.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think we're
at the end of our time.
at the end of our time.
Yes.
So we go to we move to backstage.